government is ensured that payment retires the respective circulation according to responsibility for consuming the property across the proprietary determinate lifespan. In continuing to list these incumbent duties of the common monetary foundry, then, we have 2. Uniform issuance of certified promissory obligations on the behalf of obligors. So the second duty of the common monetary foundry shall be 2. To issue qualified promissory notes to creditors upon performance of the obligations of the creditor. 3. Automated maintenance of the accounts of the people. The third duty then shall be to maintain the accounts of the people, and in so doing, to apply the most appropriate of an agreed development of classes of depreciation to respective classes of property and consumption, wherein, unless otherwise stipulated or until otherwise decided, a default pattern for determining consumption or depreciation across a practical lifespan of related property shall be, and we give a default pattern so that until the people decide on more explicit patterns of what I've called de-escalated depreciation, we have an immediate implementation to pursue. 3.3 goes on in B. Equity shall be monetizable, and in its monetizability shall comprise the effective remainder of a fully representative circulation. And 3C. In all cases, the common monetary foundry shall retire the payment of principal from circulation, thus by virtue of a perpetual resultant equivalence between remaining obligation, remaining value of related property, and remaining circulation, ever effectively including monetizable equity, in turn ensuring an immutable inflation, deflation, and maldisposition free circulation, even without regulation. And thus too we might mention that the CMF therefore holds no assets itself. 4. Necessary provision of ideal infrastructures for integration of modern automation processes. The common monetary foundry shall provide ideal infrastructures for integration of modern commercial automation processes. 5. Mandatory minimization of cost. The common monetary foundry shall deliver every object of its purposes at minimal cost and without taking profit, justly distributing costs according to willful consumption, so as its distribution of costs is comprehensive even of dormant account activity. 6. Criminality of respective breaches of authority. Any attempt to encumber rightful implementation of this proof of singular integral sustaining principles shall be treason. Which article, of course, is to explicitly apply to our court systems, our sheriffs, our district attorneys, should they fail to enforce our assertion of our rights to mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation as mandated herein. Of further interest to us in regard to implementation and this transformation to mathematically perfected economy is what we are to do in regard to taxation, or how in effect are we to resolve the prior sum of unjust artificial indebtedness, and how are we to restrict means and extents of taxation to just means and extents only. These issues are addressed in section 7.4, legal means, extents, and burdens of taxation, respective to monetization of common governmental activities and infrastructures. The sole purpose and authority of taxation shall be to impose no more and no less than minimal commensurable payment upon willful, voluntary consumers of actual and necessary assets, services, or infrastructures, provided by existing, explicit, and conformate consent of the people. 1. Monetization of government costs. Properties associated with the former convention of spending measures shall be monetized strictly by the principles of mathematically perfected economy in the duties of the common monetary foundry, and the commensurable costs of willful consumption shall be paid by consumers, likewise retiring principal at the rate of consumption or depreciation over the proprietary determinate lifespan of the related property. Now, if I may mention here, what we are doing is resolving this embedded issue which I had embedded in my parable of perfect economy, where we had the words of Mike Montagne issued to the mouth of Benjamin Franklin. It's explaining how to spend money into existence, basically, and therefore fund government without taxation. The problem that we're resolving here then is inflation and deflation. In other words, we're attaching to every unit of the currency a obligation to pay that circulation out of circulation by the person who consumes of the asset, so as we're imposing just taxation and maintaining at all times our mathematically perfected economy, even without any regulation. What's happening here is we're attaching the method of payment to the asset so that we have just taxation, and the rate of payment eliminates any need to regulate. So this is why these strictures are part of our mandate here. So if I may continue, 1A, legal scope of taxation and distribution of the burdens of taxation. Taxation shall exist only to fulfill resultant obligations to pay for consumption, and shall be levied proportionate to and solely for consensual consumption, by means which shall to the greatest practical extent fully automate compliant payment and fair distribution of costs, except whereas in the case of publicly administered insurances, in which commensurable costs are determined to be shared however otherwise, proportionate to and solely for consensual consumption, shall be understood to mean a most just, intended, and assented manner of distributing minimized costs. 1B, obligation to minimize costs. Absolute minimization of cost shall be obligated in all spending and taxation measures, which shall provide for breach of this duty to be fully refunded together with potential punitive damages to payers from all parties receiving proceeds of undue cost. In other words, this is to eliminate corruption. 2. Obligation to streamline interaction. Methods of taxation shall across their entire breadth and perpetually to the greatest extent ever practical eliminate or streamline all dutiful interaction of consumers in the means of payment. No more filling out tax forms. 2A. The general principle of this obligation shall be to associate the means of taxation with consumption of vital related properties, that a uniform rate of tax on related property shall distribute costs proportionate to consumption. For example, roadways may be paid for by fuel taxes so as to justly distribute proportionate costs, eliminating all overhead for the greatest possible number of consumers of roads. 2A1. In concurrence with this requisite pattern, no taxation of assets can be removed directly from any account maintained in the common monetary foundry, but by explicit, complete, issue-by-issue assent of the account holders. For example, in regard to assent and funding of a war, an indispensable object of a measure to collect records of voting to engage in the war shall be to designate the explicit means of distributing costs among the affirmative vote, and so, inherently and necessarily, the measure itself shall be so construed that explicit assent to remove assets directly from the common monetary foundry account of the affirmative voter is indispensably and integral to the voter's affirmation itself. And 2B, every practical minimization of the costs and duties of collection imposed shall be imperative. That is, practical minimization of costs and duties of collection shall be imperative. B1, effective compliance in every aspect of resultant implementations of collection shall perpetually be subject to public scrutiny, assent, obligatory refinement, and commensurably punitive measures without impediment in the fulfillment of each. In other words, if the payers of these taxations through any of these minimized methods can further conceive of how to further minimize either the costs or expedite the processes, the government is obliged to deploy the improvement. 3. Unlawful exercise of taxation as a regulatory device. No taxation whatever shall be exercised as a regulatory device, or shall be levied against property, production, inheritance, gift, or income. No more income tax. No more inheritance tax. And all claims of obligation to pay such taxations, however delinquent or otherwise ostensibly extended, are hereby rendered null and void. Any prior payments for ostensible infractions are thus forgiven. 4. Obligatory seizure of all prosecutions of the people for non-compliance with former unlawful exercise of taxation or inherent prior breach of authority.